In the summer of 1440, on the rolling hills of Tuscany, something extraordinary happened that would puzzle historians for centuries. A massive battle raged for hours under the scorching Italian Sunday. Thousands of soldiers clashed with steel and fury. War cries echoed across the valley. Horses thundered through clouds of dust. When the smoke cleared and the last banner fell, one army had claimed total victory while the other retreated in defeat. The political map of Renaissance Italy had been redrawn forever. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-bending. In this epic clash of armies, this decisive engagement that changed the course of history, exactly one person died. One. Not 100. Not 1,000. One single death in an entire day of warfare. And according to the great political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli, that lone casualty didn't even die from a sword thrust or an arrow. He fell off his horse. Welcome to the Battle of Anghiari, the most civilized war in human history. This is the story of how Renaissance Italy turned warfare into an elaborate chess match where nobody wanted to die, and how one man's attempt to capture its glory created one of art history's greatest mysteries. Because 5 decades later, Leonardo da Vinci would try to immortalize this bloodless battle in what should have been his masterpiece. Instead, he created a ghost, a painting that vanished almost as mysteriously as the battle itself had unfolded. But before we dive into Leonardo's tragic masterpiece, we need to understand how a real war could produce virtually no casualties. The answer lies in the bizarre world of Renaissance warfare, where soldiers fought not for God or country, but for cold, hard cash. Picture this. You're a professional soldier in 15th century Italy. Your trade is war, but your goal isn't death or glory. It's survival and profit. You've spent years perfecting the art of combat, learning to wield sword and lance with deadly precision. But here's the catch. If you die in battle, your career is over, permanently. No pension plan, no insurance policy, just a shallow grave and a grieving family. Now imagine that the enemy soldiers charging toward you aren't fanatic crusaders or patriotic defenders. They're professionals just like you. Men who learned their craft in the same mercenary companies, who might have fought beside you in last year's campaign, who understand that today's enemy could be tomorrow's comrade in arms. Would you really want to run each other through with steel? Or would you prefer to put on a good show, collect your pay, and live to fight another day? This was the reality of condottieri warfare. The condottieri were mercenary captains who dominated Italian battlefields throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. These weren't bloodthirsty barbarians seeking death or glory. They were businessmen whose product happened to be military service. And like any smart businessman, they understood that protecting your most valuable asset, your life, was essential for long-term success. The system worked like this. Italian city-states, too wealthy and sophisticated to rely on citizen militias, hired these professional companies to fight their wars. Florence might hire one condottiere to defend their territory, while Milan hired another to attack it. The condottieri would march their men to the designated battlefield, deploy in proper formation, and engage in what looked like serious combat. Lances would lower, swords would clash, men would shout and charge. But underneath the spectacle lay an unspoken understanding. We're all professionals here. Let this civilized. Niccolò Piccinino embodied everything both admirable and terrible about this system. Short in stature but towering in ambition, lame in one leg but swift in tactical thinking, Piccinino had clawed his way from humble origins to become one of Italy's most feared commanders. He was brave to the point of recklessness, yet calculating enough to survive decades of warfare. Cruel when necessary, treacherous when profitable, but above all, a survivor in a world where survival meant everything. By 1440, Piccinino commanded the armies of Milan under Duke Filippo Maria Visconti. His target was the fortress town of Anghiari, a strategic stronghold that controlled the vital mountain passes between Florence and the Papal territories. If Milan could dominate, centralize Anghiari, they wool Italy. If Florence could hold it, they would secure their southern border and maintain their independence. The stakes couldn't have been higher, but the methods would be uniquely civilized. On the night of June 28th, Piccinino's forces approached Anghiari like shadows moving through the Tuscan darkness. His army was formidable, perhaps 4,000 strong, reinforced by local militias who saw opportunity in Milan's advance. The town's defenders, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, seemed doomed. Piccinino had achieved complete surprise. His veteran cavalry could strike at dawn and overwhelm the hastily assembled Florentine forces before reinforcements could arrive. It should have been a massacre. In any other age, in any other place, it would have been. But this was Renaissance Italy, where even war followed rules of etiquette. As the sun rose over Anghiari on June 29, 1440, the most polite battle in military history began. Both campsets sounded from, not in fury but almost in greeting. Banners unfurled in the morning breeze like colorful invitations to a tournament. Knights adjusted their armor with the care of courtiers preparing for a state dinner. This wasn't just warfare, it was performance art. The Florentine commander, Micheletto Attendolo, had rushed north with whatever forces he could muster. His men were tired from forced marches, outnumbered by Piccinino's professionals, and fighting far from home. By every military calculation, they should have been crushed. But Attendolo understood the rules of this peculiar game. He deployed his forces not to fight to the death, but to fight with honor, skill, and above all, restraint. What followed was unlike any battle before or since. Cavalry charges thundered across the field, but somehow riders managed to stay in their saddles. Lances shattered spectacularly against shields, but rarely found flesh. Swords clashed in elaborate choreography that looked deadly from a distance, but left both combatants breathing. Men fell dramatically from their horses, lay still for appropriate intervals, then quietly crawled to safety when nobody was looking. For 4 hours, this elaborate dance continued. Dust clouds rose and swirled. War cries echoed off the surrounding hills. Standards changed hands multiple times as both sides demonstrated their skill and valor. To observers, it must have looked like the epic battles of ancient Rome or medieval legend. Knights in gleaming armor, horses foaming with exertion, the clash of steel on steel creating a symphony of martial glory. But as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western mountains, something unexpected happened. Despite all the careful choreography, despite all the professional courtesy, one side actually started winning. The tide turned not through superior ferocity, but through superior positioning and tactical brilliance. Attendolo had studied the terrain around Anghiari with an engineer's eye. He understood that the narrow valley would compress Piccinino's numerical advantage, forcing the Milanese army into bottlenecks where their greater numbers became a liability. As the battle wore on, the Florentine forces began to maneuver with deadly precision, pushing their opponents toward increasingly disadvantageous ground. Piccinino found himself caught in a trap of his own making. His confidence in superior numbers had led him into terrain that negated his advantage. His professional soldiers, masters of civilized warfare, suddenly faced opponents who were fighting not just for pay, but for the survival of their republic. The careful balance of Renaissance combat began to tip towards something more desperate and real. As shadows lengthened across the battlefield and the day's heat gave way to evening cool, the great experiment in civilized warfare was about to reach its strangest conclusion. The Battle of Anghiari would end with total victory for Florence, complete defeat for Milan, and a casualty list that would make military historians question everything they thought they knew about Renaissance combat. And then came the moment that would echo through history books and baffle scholars for generations. As the Milanese forces found themselves pressed against the marshy ground near the Tiber's tributaries, their orderly retreat began to dissolve into something approaching actual chaos. Horses stumbled in the soft earth. Knights who had spent the day performing elaborate combat rituals suddenly faced the very real possibility of capture, humiliation, or worse, damaged reputations that could cost them future contracts. But even in this moment of genuine crisis, the strange code of condottieri warfare held firm. As Piccinino's men fell back through the narrow valley, as Florentine cavalry pursued with what looked like murderous intent, as the carefully choreographed battle threatened to become something messily real, the professionals on both sides seemed to remember their unspoken agreement. This was business, not personal. The pursuit that followed was perhaps even more remarkable than the battle itself. Attendelo's forces chased the retreating Milanese for miles, their war cries echoing off the hillsides, their banners streaming in the evening air. From any distance, it looked like a classic route, the kind of devastating pursuit that could destroy an entire army and end a war. But somehow, almost miraculously, nearly every fleeing soldier managed to find safety. Knights who stumbled were helped to their feet by their pursuers. Cavalry who caught isolated infantry often settled for accepting symbolic surrender rather than delivering killing blows. Men who should have been cut down instead found themselves courteously invited to yield their weapons and await ransom negotiations. It was as if both armies had agreed that the show must go on, but nobody needed to actually die for it. When the final tally was counted as darkness fell over Anghiari, the results defied every expectation of medieval warfare. The Florentines had won a complete and decisive victory. Piccinino's reputation lay in tatters. Milan's ambitions in central Italy had been shattered. The political balance of the peninsula had shifted dramatically toward Florence and her allies. By any measure, this had been a battle of enormous historical consequence. And yet, somehow, almost everyone went home to their families that night. The single death that did occur became the subject of endless fascination among chroniclers and military historians. Was it truly an accident, as Machiavelli claimed? Did one unfortunate soldier simply lose his balance at the wrong moment, tumbling from his mount into the marshy ground where he drowned in water, barely deep enough to cover a man's chest? Or was there more to the story? Some small moment where the careful choreography broke down and war became briefly, tragically real. The truth may never be known, but what's certain is that this lone casualty became the perfect symbol of Renaissance warfare's bizarre contradictions. Here was combat that looked absolutely deadly but remained remarkably safe. Here were professional soldiers who could stage the appearance of total war while maintaining the reality of civilized restraint. Here was a military system that had somehow transformed humanity's most brutal activity into something approaching performance art. But the strangest chapter of the Anghiari story was yet to come, because 65 years later, when the memory of that bloodless battle had faded into historical curiosity, the greatest artistic genius of the Renaissance would attempt to capture its essence in paint and bring its ghostly violence back to life. Leonardo da Vinci arrived at this project with a reputation that preceded him across all of Italy. By 1505, he was no longer just a painter or sculptor or engineer. He was Leonardo, the master who had created wonders that seemed to bridge the gap between human craft and divine inspiration. The Last Supper had established him as perhaps the greatest painter alive. His notebooks bulged with designs for flying machines, war engines, and architectural marvels that seemed to come from some future age. When the Florentine Republic commissioned him to commemorate their great victory at Anghiari, they weren't just hiring an artist, they were summoning a magician. The commission itself was breathtaking in scope and ambition. Leonardo was to cover an entire wall of the Hall of 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio, creating a mural that would stretch 54 feet wide and 21 feet high. This wasn't to be merely a painting, but a total environment, an immersive experience that would transport viewers directly onto the battlefield where Florence had secured her greatest triumph. But Leonardo brought to this project something no previous artist possessed. He had served as a military engineer, had studied the mechanics of warfare with the same obsessive precision he applied to human anatomy or hydraulic engineering. He understood how horses moved under stress, how armor buckled under impact, how men's faces transformed in the heat of combat. Where other artists might paint war as they imagined it should look, Leonardo could paint war as it actually was. His preparatory studies reveal an almost scientific approach to depicting violence. Sheet after sheet of drawings explored every angle of cavalry combat. Horses rearing with nostrils flared and eyes rolling in terror. Warriors locked in desperate struggle over battle standards. Faces contorted not with heroic determination but with the raw, animal fury that emerges when civilized men confront mortal danger. This was not going to be another pretty picture of knightly combat. This would be war stripped of its romantic pretenses, violence revealed in all its chaotic brutality. Leonardo planned to show his viewers what the soldiers at Anghiari had somehow managed to avoid experiencing themselves. The central scene, known today as the Fight for the Standard, would depict four mounted warriors engaged in a desperate struggle for a battle flag. But Leonardo's genius lay in the details that transformed a conventional military scene into something unprecedented. The horses weren't just vehicles for their riders, but active participants in the violence, biting and striking at each other with a ferocity that matched their masters. The men's faces weren't heroic masks, but studies in human psychology under extreme stress, revealing the complex mixture of fear, rage, and determination that drives soldiers in combat. Every element of the composition was calculated to create maximum emotional impact. The swirling dust clouds would blur the boundaries between figures, creating a sense of chaos and confusion. The positioning of bodies would draw viewers' eyes inexorably toward the central struggle, making them feel like participants rather than observers. The play of light and shadow would heighten every dramatic moment, transforming the flat surface of the wall into a window onto another world. But Leonardo's ambitions extended beyond mere artistic innovation. He was determined to revolutionize the very technique of mural painting itself. Traditional fresco work required artists to paint quickly on wet plaster, leaving no room for the kind of detailed refinement that characterized Leonardo's greatest works. Instead, he would experiment with an ancient Roman technique called encaustic painting, using heated wax as a medium that would allow him unlimited time for perfection. The decision would prove catastrophic, but at the time it seemed like inspired innovation. Leonardo had always been fascinated by technical challenges, always convinced that his engineering genius could solve any practical problem. If he could design flying machines and siege engines, surely he could master an ancient painting technique. As work began in the Hall of 500, all of Florence watched with anticipation. This would be Leonardo's first major public work since The Last Supper, his chance to create something that would establish his reputation for all time. The scaffolding alone was a masterpiece of engineering, an ingenious system of pulleys and platforms that could be adjusted to any height. Workers marveled at the precision of Leonardo's preliminary drawings, the mathematical perfection of his compositions, the way every element seemed to flow naturally into the next. For months, the project proceeded exactly as planned. The central battle scene took shape with breathtaking power and beauty. Witnesses described being physically moved by the intensity of Leonardo's vision, by the way his painted warriors seemed to leap from the wall with supernatural life. This was more than art. This was resurrection, the bringing back to life of men and horses who had died decades before. But beneath the surface success, disaster was quietly taking shape. The technique Leonardo had chosen required precise temperature control, a delicate balance between heat and timing that would make or break his masterpiece. He had studied ancient Roman texts describing encaustic painting, convinced that he could resurrect a lost art form that would give his work unprecedented depth and permanence. The wax-based pigments would allow him to build up layers of color with jewel-like intensity, creating effects impossible with traditional fresco techniques. But theory and practice are cruel masters, and they rarely align as perfectly as genius imagines. As Leonardo applied his experimental medium to the prepared wall, everything seemed to proceed according to plan. The pigments flowed beautifully, allowing him to capture subtle gradations of light and shadow that brought his warriors to vivid life. The horses' muscles rippled beneath their painted hides. The soldiers' faces contorted with emotions so real that viewers felt they could hear their battle cries echoing through the hall. This wasn't just painting. This was magic made visible. Then came the moment when confidence transformed into catastrophe. To accelerate the drying process and set his experimental medium permanently, Leonardo positioned braziers beneath his work. The heat would cure the wax-based pigments, locking his vision into the wall for eternity. He had calculated the temperatures carefully, tested his materials on small samples, convinced himself that his engineering precision would triumph over any technical obstacles. Instead, he watched in horror as his masterpiece began to weep. The pigments, unable to withstand the heat he had applied, started to flow down the wall like colorful tears. His warriors, so carefully crafted over months of meticulous work, began to blur and distort. The horses that had seemed ready to leap from the surface dissolved into abstract smears. The faces that had captured the very essence of human emotion melted into unrecognizable masses of color. Leonardo stood transfixed as years of preparation and months of execution vanished before his eyes. This wasn't just artistic failure. This was the complete destruction of what he had believed would be his greatest achievement. The man who had solved countless technical puzzles, who had designed machines that wouldn't be built for centuries, who had unlocked secrets of anatomy and engineering that eluded lesser minds, had been defeated by paint and heat. The psychological impact was devastating. Leonardo had staked his reputation on this commission, had promised the Florentine Republic a work that would immortalize their greatest military triumph. Instead, he had created a monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition and experimental overreach. The hall that should have celebrated Florence's victory now bore witness to his humiliation. Within days, Leonardo made a decision that would echo through art history. He abandoned the project entirely and left Florence, never to return. The man who had spent his life pushing boundaries, challenging conventional wisdom, refusing to accept limitations, had finally encountered a problem his genius couldn't solve. The Battle of Anghiari, both the historical engagement and its artistic commemoration, had claimed another victim. But the story of Leonardo's lost masterpiece was far from over. Giorgio Vasari, the great chronicler of Renaissance art, later described what remained of Leonardo's work in terms that mixed admiration with tragedy. Even in its damaged state, even reduced to fragmentary glimpses of its original glory, the painting retained power that moved viewers to wonder at what had been lost. The central scene, showing warriors locked in combat over a battle standard, survived long enough for other artists to study and copy its revolutionary approach to depicting violence. These copies, particularly one made by Peter Paul Rubens decades later, became our only window into Leonardo's vision. Through Rubens' interpretation, we can glimpse something of what the complete work might have achieved. The swirling composition, the psychological intensity of the figures, the way human and animal forms seem to merge in the chaos of combat, all hint at a revolutionary approach to historical painting that died with its creator's failure. The irony runs deeper than simple technical mishap. Leonardo had attempted to capture a battle famous for its lack of bloodshed, to give violent visual form to an engagement that had been remarkable precisely for its restraint. His failure to complete the work created an accidental parallel to the historical battle itself. Both the original conflict and its artistic recreation had become famous not for what they achieved, but for what they failed to deliver. Yet the ghost of Leonardo's vision refused to stay buried. Decades later, when Cosimo de' Medici ordered renovations to the Hall of 500, he commissioned Vasari to cover the walls with new frescoes celebrating Florentine military victories. Vasari, who had written admiringly of Leonardo's lost work, found himself in the position of literally painting over the ruins of a masterpiece. But perhaps he couldn't bring himself to completely destroy what remained of his predecessor's genius. Hidden within Vasari's new fresco, a mysterious detail catches the eye of careful observers. High on the wall, almost invisible unless you know where to look, two words appear on a battle flag held by a Florentine soldier: Cerca trova, seek and you shall find. For centuries, these words were dismissed as decorative flourishes, meaningless additions to a conventional military scene. But in recent decades, they have taken on almost mystical significance for those who believe Leonardo's masterpiece might still exist, hidden beneath layers of later paint and plaster. The possibility seems almost too fantastic to believe. Could Vasari, tasked with covering Leonardo's failure, have instead chosen to preserve it? Could the greatest lost work in art history be waiting just inches behind a wall that thousands of visitors pass every year? The idea has sparked decades of investigation, controversy, and debate that continues to divide the art world. Modern technology has added new chapters to this centuries-old mystery. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies in the wall structure that suggest hidden spaces behind Vasari's fresco. Thermal imaging has detected temperature variations that might indicate different materials beneath the surface. Chemical analysis of tiny samples has found pigments and binding agents that don't match Vasari's known techniques. Each new discovery adds fuel to the debate without definitively resolving it. Believers point to mounting evidence that something significant lies hidden behind the visible surface. Skeptics argue that wishful thinking has transformed ordinary architectural features into proof of an impossible preservation miracle. The controversy reached its peak when researchers gained permission to drill tiny holes through Vasari's fresco, inserting fiber optic cameras to glimpse what lay behind. The images they captured were tantalizing but inconclusive. Patches of color that might be Leonardo's pigments, brush strokes that could indicate his technique. Evidence that seemed to support the theory of hidden masterpiece, but nothing definitive enough to end the debate. The scientific investigation was eventually suspended amid concerns about potential damage to Vasari's authenticated work. The question of whether Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari survives in some form may never receive a definitive answer. Like the historical battle it was meant to commemorate, the painting has become famous as much for what remains unknown as for what can be proven. This uncertainty has transformed both the original battle and its lost artistic interpretation into something larger than their individual histories. They have become symbols of the Renaissance itself, with all its contradictions and complexities. The battle represented warfare transformed into performance, violence rendered civilized through professional courtesy and economic calculation. The painting represented artistic ambition pushed beyond technical limitations, genius defeated by the very innovation that defined it. The Battle of Anghiari and Leonardo's ghost painting have become perfect mirrors of each other, two mysteries that capture the Renaissance spirit in all its contradictory glory. A battle that achieved total victory through civilized restraint, and a masterpiece that vanished through ambitious innovation. Both remind us that history's most fascinating stories often lie not in what was accomplished, but in what was attempted and lost. Whether Leonardo's warriors still fight their eternal struggle beneath Vasari's walls, or whether they dissolved forever in that moment of catastrophic heat, they continue to haunt us with possibilities. Sometimes the greatest art lies not in what we can see, but in what we dare to imagine might still be waiting to be found.